The rain hammered against the windows of the Miller home in suburban Portland, Oregon, creating a rhythmic melody that had once brought comfort to Eleanor Miller. But on this particular Thursday evening in early April 2024, the sound only amplified the heaviness settling in her chest. She stood at the kitchen sink, her 73-year-old hands trembling slightly as she washed the same plate for the third time, her mind elsewhere, lost in thoughts she desperately wished she could silence. Through the archway she could see Frank in his worn leather recliner, the one they'd bought 32 years ago when Michael had graduated from high school. Her husband's breathing was labored tonight, more so than usual. At 76, Frank Miller carried the weight of a lifetime of manual labor in his shoulders, his calloused hands resting on the armrests like ancient maps telling stories of sacrifice. The stroke he'd suffered 6 weeks ago had left his right side weakened, his speech slightly slurred, but his mind remained sharp as ever, perhaps too sharp for the reality they now faced. Eleanor dried her hands on a faded dish towel embroidered with sunflowers, a gift from Emily during her college years, back when their youngest daughter still smiled at them with genuine warmth. The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor that the towel, frayed and worn from years of use, had outlasted the affection that came with it. "Ellie," Frank called out, his voice rough with fatigue, "come sit with me for a minute." She made her way to the living room, lowering herself onto the matching ottoman that sat before his chair. The furniture set had been a luxury purchase decades ago, bought with the overtime Frank had earned working double shifts at the textile factory. They'd been so proud then, so full of hope for what their hard work would create for their children. Frank reached out with his left hand, the strong one, and grasped Eleanor's fingers. His grip was still firm despite everything. "We need to talk about what Michael said on the phone yesterday." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "Frank, please, not tonight." "Every night you say not tonight," Frank replied, his pale blue eyes meeting hers with the same determined look she'd fallen in love with 54 years ago. "But tonight is all we have, sweetheart. Tomorrow might bring more of the same, or it might bring something worse." The rain intensified, and somewhere in the distance thunder rolled across the Willamette Valley. Eleanor thought about Michael's call, how her firstborn son, her brilliant engineer who now lived in a penthouse overlooking the San Francisco Bay, had spoken to her as though she were a stranger, soliciting donations on the street. "Mom, I don't understand why you're calling me about Dad's medical bills again," Michael had said, his voice clipped with irritation. "You have insurance, don't you?" "The insurance doesn't cover everything, sweetheart," Eleanor had explained, hating the pleading tone that crept into her voice. "The physical therapy, the medications, the home modifications we need to make. It's been over $47,000 already, and the doctors say he needs at least 6 more months of intensive treatment." There had been a long pause, filled only by the ambient sounds of what Eleanor imagined was Michael's luxurious office. "That's not really my problem, is it?" he'd finally said. "You and Dad made your choices. You chose to spend everything on us, and now we've made our own lives. I have my own expenses. Victoria and I just put down a deposit on a summer home in Napa Valley. We can't be expected to bail you out every time there's a crisis." Bail you out. As if the 73 years of her life, the 54 years of marriage, the countless sacrificed dreams and deferred pleasures had all been leading to this moment where she became a burden, a financial inconvenience to the child she'd carried for 9 months and nurtured for 18 years under her roof and a lifetime in her heart. "Sarah said something similar when I called her on Tuesday," Eleanor said quietly, pulling herself back to the present moment with Frank. "She told me that she has her own children to think about, her own future to secure. She said we should consider selling the house." Frank's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his weathered cheek. "This house that we bought with the money from my father's life insurance. This house where we raised all 4 of them. This house where Sarah had her wedding reception in the backyard because she wanted something intimate and meaningful." Eleanor remembered that day 11 years ago when their middle daughter had married Thomas Chen, the successful cardiac surgeon. They'd strung lights across the garden, set up tables beneath the old oak tree, and Eleanor had spent 3 days cooking alongside her sisters to provide a feast for 140 guests. Sarah had cried tears of joy, thanking her parents for giving her the perfect day, for always giving her everything she needed. "David didn't even return my call," Eleanor added, her voice barely above a whisper. "I left 4 messages with his assistant Frank. Our son has someone screening his mother's calls." David, their artistic soul, who had struggled through his 20s trying to find his voice as a painter. Frank and Eleanor had supported him through it all, paying his rent in Brooklyn for 7 years while he found his artistic identity. They'd attended every gallery showing, purchased his pieces when no one else would, connected him with collectors from Frank's old factory connections. Now David's abstract paintings sold for 6 figures each. His name appeared in prestigious art magazines, and his mother's calls went unanswered, filtered through an assistant paid to protect him from inconvenient interruptions. "And Emily?" Frank asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. Emily, their youngest, their baby who had clung to Eleanor's skirts as a toddler, who had called her mother her best friend throughout high school. Emily, who had graduated summa cum laude from the University of Oregon's architecture program, funded entirely by the second mortgage Frank had taken on this very house. "She said that William thinks we're being financially irresponsible," Eleanor said, anger finally creeping into her voice. "She said her husband believes we're trying to guilt them into supporting us, that we should have planned better for retirement." William, the name tasted bitter in Eleanor's mouth. William Hartwell, the slick financial consultant who had swept Emily off her feet 8 years ago with his designer suits and talk of investment portfolios. William, who had convinced Frank to sell his small hardware store 5 years ago, promising to find a buyer who would pay top dollar, only to connect Frank with a corporation that purchased the business for a fraction of its worth. Frank had suspected something wasn't right, but he'd trusted his son-in-law, trusted that family meant something. The hardware store, Frank's dream realized after 35 years of working for others. Gone, sold for $215,000 when it had been appraised at over $800,000. Eleanor had watched her husband's spirit crack that day, had seen him age a decade in the span of signing those papers. "They want us to give them their inheritance now," Frank said suddenly, his voice stronger despite the tremor the stroke had left behind. "That's what this is really about. Michael said it outright last week. He said that the house is worth at least $650,000, probably more in this market. Split 4 ways, that's over $160,000 each. He said we should sell, downsize to a small apartment, and give them what's rightfully theirs so they can invest it while they're young enough to see returns." Eleanor stood abruptly, her heart pounding. "This house is our home, Frank. We've lived here for 44 years. This is where I planted the rose garden. This is where you built the tree house for the kids. This is where we've celebrated every Christmas, every birthday, every milestone. How can they ask us to give that up? How can they ask us to erase our history, our memories for money? Because to them, that's all it is now," Frank said sadly. "It's not the home where they grew up. It's not the sanctuary we built for our family. It's an asset. A number on a balance sheet, a missed opportunity for wealth accumulation." The thunder cracked closer now, and the lights flickered briefly. Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the street where she'd watched her children ride bicycles, where she'd taught Sarah to drive, where Michael had proposed to Victoria beneath the cherry blossom trees that lined the sidewalk. The neighborhood had changed over the decades, young families moving in as older residents passed away or relocated to assisted living facilities, but the bones of the community remained the same. "When did it happen?" Eleanor asked, her breath fogging the cold glass. "When did we lose them?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, and when Eleanor turned back to look at him, she saw tears streaming down his weathered face. In 54 years of marriage, she'd seen her husband cry exactly 3 times: when his mother died, when his best friend was killed in an industrial accident, and the day he'd signed away his hardware store. This made 4. "I don't know, Ellie," Frank said, his voice breaking. I keep going back through the years, trying to find the moment when gratitude turned to entitlement, when love became expectation, when we stopped being their parents and became obstacles to their ambitions. Was it when we paid for Michael's master's degree instead of making him take out loans? Was it when we gave Sarah $50,000 for her down payment? Was it when we supported David through his starving artist phase? Was it when we mortgaged our home to pay for Emily's education? We did what parents do, Eleanor said fiercely, crossing back to him and kneeling beside his chair. We sacrificed so they could have better lives than we did. We wanted them to reach for stars we could never touch. That's not wrong, Frank, that's love. But maybe we loved too much, Frank replied, touching her cheek with his trembling hand. Maybe we gave them so much that they never learned the value of struggle, the dignity of earning, the grace of gratitude. Maybe we protected them from hardship so completely that they never developed the empathy to recognize it in others, even in us. The doorbell rang, cutting through their conversation like a knife. Eleanor and Frank exchanged glances, neither expecting visitors at 9:30 on a Thursday night. Eleanor rose slowly, her knees protesting after kneeling on the hardwood floor, and made her way to the front door. Through the frosted glass panel, she could see 4 figures standing on the porch, backlit by the street lamp. Her heart leapt for a moment, hope surging despite everything. Had her children come? Had they reconsidered? Had some spark of the love she'd nurtured in them finally broken through their selfishness? She opened the door. Michael stood in front, his expensive wool coat darkened by rain. Behind him were Sarah, David, and Emily, all dressed in clothes that cost more than Eleanor's monthly grocery budget. But their faces held no warmth, no contrition, no love. Instead, Eleanor saw something that chilled her more thoroughly than the April storm: determination, cold and unyielding. "Mom," Michael said, not bothering with pleasantries, "we need to talk, all of us, right now." And in that moment, as lightning split the sky and thunder shook the foundation of the home she'd built with love and sacrifice, Eleanor Miller understood that the worst was yet to come. The children she'd raised, the lives she'd nurtured, the dreams she'd funded, had come not to help, but to demand. And nothing, she realized with dawning horror, would ever be the same. The tension in the Miller living room was suffocating, thick as the humidity that had preceded the storm now raging outside. Eleanor stood near the doorway, her hand still gripping the doorknob, as if it were an anchor preventing her from being swept away by the nightmare unfolding before her. Frank remained in his recliner, his weakened body upright with effort, his eyes moving from one child to the next, searching desperately for some sign of the love he knew had once existed. Michael had taken position in the center of the room, standing on the very rug where he'd played with toy trucks as a child. Sarah perched on the edge of the sofa, her designer handbag clutched in her lap like armor. David leaned against the bookshelf Frank had built by hand 40 years ago, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression deliberately neutral. Emily stood by the window, refusing to meet her mother's eyes, her shoulders tense beneath her tailored blazer. "We're not here to argue," Michael began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he must use in boardrooms. "We're here to present a solution that benefits everyone." "Everyone?" Frank repeated, his stroke-affected speech making the word sound like a question and an accusation simultaneously. "Tell me, son, how does everyone benefit when you haven't offered to help with a single medical bill?" Michael's jaw tightened. "That's exactly the point, Dad. You keep asking us for money, but you're sitting on a gold mine. This house, in this neighborhood, in this market, is worth somewhere between $650,000 and $750,000. Meanwhile, you're asking us, your children who have our own families and obligations, to subsidize your living expenses." "Subsidize?" Eleanor felt her voice rising, years of patient motherhood cracking under the weight of this callousness. "Is that what you call helping your father recover from a stroke? Subsidizing?" Sarah finally spoke, her voice measured and clinical, the same tone she probably used when delivering difficult diagnoses to the parents of her young patients. "Mom, you're being emotional. Let's look at this rationally. You and Dad are in your 70s. This house is far too large for 2 people. The maintenance alone must be costing you thousands annually. The property taxes in this area have tripled in the last decade. It makes no financial sense for you to stay here." "This is our home," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "We raised you here. Every room holds memories of you, of us as a family." "Memories don't pay medical bills," David interjected, speaking for the first time. His artist's hands that Eleanor had bandaged countless times after childhood scrapes, gestured dismissively at the surroundings. "Look around, Mom. This furniture is ancient. The appliances are outdated. You're clinging to the past while drowning in the present." Eleanor stared at her son, remembering the young man who had once painted a portrait of her in the kitchen titled "The Heart of Home." That painting had been featured in his first major gallery showing. She'd stood beside it, beaming with pride, as strangers praised his ability to capture maternal love and domestic warmth. Now that same artist looked at this home, at her, with cold calculation. "What exactly are you proposing?" Frank asked quietly, though Eleanor could hear the tremor in his voice that had nothing to do with his stroke. Michael pulled a folder from his briefcase, the leather case embossed with his initials, a gift from Eleanor and Frank for his 40th birthday 2 years ago. He opened it, extracting several printed pages. "We've done the research. We've consulted with a real estate agent who specializes in this neighborhood. We have buyers already interested in properties like this. We're proposing that you sell the house within the next 60 days. After paying off your remaining mortgage of approximately $97,000 and accounting for selling costs, you'll clear around $600,000. He paused, glancing at his siblings before continuing. "Of that $600,000, we propose that each of us, your 4 children, receive $100,000. That's our inheritance, Dad. The money you would have left us anyway. By giving it to us now, while you're alive, you'll actually save on estate taxes later." Eleanor felt her legs weakening. "And what about us? What about the $200,000 remaining?" "That's more than enough for you to rent a nice 1-bedroom apartment in a senior community," Sarah answered, her tone suggesting she thought she was being generous. "Even at $2,000 per month, that's nearly 8 years of rent paid in full, and you'd still have money left over for Dad's medical expenses." "A 1-bedroom apartment," Frank repeated slowly, each word seeming to cost him something vital. "You want your mother and me, after 44 years in this home, after a lifetime of sacrifice for you, to move into a 1-bedroom apartment so you can have money that isn't even rightfully yours yet." "It is rightfully ours," Emily said suddenly, her voice sharp, finally turning from the window to face them. "You promised, Dad. You always said that everything you built was for us, that we were the reason you worked so hard. Well, we need that investment now. William and I are trying to expand his consulting firm. We need capital. Sarah and Thomas want to open a second practice. Michael is looking at investment opportunities that require liquid assets. David needs to purchase a larger studio space in Manhattan. This money, Dad, it's not just sitting in a house doing nothing. It could be working for all of us, growing, multiplying." "William," Frank said, and there was something dark in his voice that Eleanor had rarely heard. "This whole idea came from William, didn't it?" Emily's face flushed. "William is a financial consultant, Dad. He understands these things better than you do. He says you made poor choices selling the hardware store when you did, that you undervalued the business. He says you're making poor choices now by refusing to liquidate your primary asset." "Poor choices," Frank echoed, and suddenly he was pushing himself up from his chair, his left side compensating for his weakened right. Eleanor moved toward him, but he waved her off, standing on his own, despite the visible effort it required. "Let me tell you about poor choices, Emily. Let me tell you about the financial consultant you married." "Frank," Eleanor warned, but her husband continued, his voice growing stronger with anger that had been simmering for 5 years. "5 years ago, William convinced me to sell my hardware store. He said he had connections, that he could get me top dollar. The store was appraised at $823,000. Do you know what I sold it for, Emily? Do you know what your husband's connections paid me?" Emily's face had gone pale. "Dad," That's not $215,000, Frank cut her off. A quarter of what it was worth. And do you know why? Because William's connections gave him a finder's fee, a percentage of the difference between the appraised value and the sale price. Your husband, Emily, your financial genius husband, made over $75,000 by defrauding your own father. The room went absolutely silent except for the rain hammering against the windows. Thunder rolled in the distance, a sound like judgment approaching. That's a serious accusation, Michael said carefully, his lawyer wife's influence evident in his measured response. Do you have proof? I have bank statements showing wire transfers, Frank replied. I have emails I found by accident on Emily's laptop 3 years ago when I was helping her fix a virus. Emails between William and the buyer discussing the arrangement. I never said anything because I didn't want to destroy my daughter's marriage. I thought maybe William would feel guilty. Maybe he'd find some way to make it right. But instead, he's convinced all of you that I'm the one who made poor financial choices. Emily's hands were shaking. You're lying. William wouldn't. I'm not lying, sweetheart, Frank said, and his voice gentle despite everything. And deep down, I think you know that. I think you've known for a while. Why do you think William never comes to family dinners? Why do you think he always has an excuse when we invite you both over? He knows I know. He's just been waiting me out, hoping I'd die before the truth came out. This is absurd, David interjected, pushing off from the bookshelf. Even if that's true, even if William did something shady 5 years ago, that has nothing to do with the current situation. You still need to face reality. You can't afford this house. You can't afford Dad's medical care. You're asking us to pay for your inability to plan ahead. Eleanor felt something break inside her, some final thread of hope that had been holding her together. Inability to plan ahead? David, your father worked 60-hour weeks for 40 years. We saved every penny we could, but every time we started to build something for ourselves, one of you needed something. Michael needed money for his master's degree after his scholarship fell through, $28,000. Sarah needed help with her down payment on the house, $50,000. David, you needed rent money for 7 years in New York while you found yourself over $84,000 total. Emily needed her education paid for, $43,000 after scholarships, not to mention weddings, cars, medical emergencies, business loans. We gave you everything, every single thing we had. That was your choice, Sarah said coldly. We didn't force you to give us anything. You offered. You insisted, actually. We want you to have better than we did, you always said. We don't want you to struggle like we struggled. Well, congratulations, Mom. We don't struggle. We succeeded. And now you're trying to make us feel guilty for accepting the help you freely gave. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty, Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face now. I'm trying to make you feel something, anything. I'm trying to find my children in these strangers standing in my living room. Enough with the emotional manipulation, Michael snapped. We came here with a reasonable proposal. Sell the house, give us what would have been our inheritance anyway, and use the rest to set yourselves up comfortably. It's a win-win situation. And if we refuse? Frank asked, though Eleanor could see he already knew the answer. Michael's expression hardened into something Eleanor didn't recognize. Then don't expect any more help from us, not with medical bills, not with living expenses, not with anything. We're all in agreement on this, Dad, all 4 of us. We're not going to keep throwing money into the black hole of your poor planning. You sell the house and distribute the inheritance now, or you're on your own. The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, choking off all remaining hope. Eleanor looked at each of her children in turn, searching for some crack in their resolve, some glimmer of the kids who had once made her breakfast in bed on Mother's Day, who had cried in her arms after breakups, who had whispered, "I love you, Mom," before drifting off to sleep each night. She found nothing but cold determination and entitled expectation. "Get out," Frank said quietly. "Dad!" Emily started, but Frank's voice grew louder, filling the room with a power that defied his weakened body. "Get out! Get out of my house! Get out of our home! You come here, to the house where we loved you and raised you and sacrificed everything for you, and you demand that we make ourselves homeless to line your pockets? You threaten to abandon us, your own parents, unless we comply with your greed. Get out, all of you! Get out now!" Michael's face flushed with anger. "Fine. You want to be stubborn. You want to cling to your pride and this rotting house. Then do it alone. Don't call me again, Dad. Don't call any of us. You're making your choice, and we're making ours." He stormed toward the door, and his siblings followed, like ducklings in a row, Sarah and David and Emily one after another. Emily paused at the threshold, looking back at her parents, and for just a moment, Eleanor thought she saw something. Some shadow of regret or doubt. But then Emily's jaw set, and she followed her brothers and sister out into the rain. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the house like a death knell. Eleanor and Frank stood in their living room, surrounded by 44 years of memories, completely alone in a way they had never been before, not even in the early days of their marriage, when they'd had nothing but each other and hope for the future. Outside, car doors slammed, engines started, taillights disappeared into the stormy night, and in the kitchen, unnoticed by either Eleanor or Frank, a dish towel that had fallen too close to the stove burner began to smolder, a tiny orange glow that would soon become something much, much worse. Frank reached for Eleanor and she came to him, and they held each other in the center of their living room, two elderly people clinging together against the cruelty of the world, against the betrayal of those they'd loved most, against the approaching disaster they couldn't yet see but would soon consume everything they had left. The fire alarm would start screaming in exactly 7 minutes. Urgisen! Such as the smoke alarm's piercing shriek shattered the silence at exactly 9:57 p.m., April 22nd, 2024. Eleanor jerked in Frank's arms, her heart already racing from the emotional devastation of the last hour, now skyrocketing into pure panic as the acrid smell of smoke reached her nostrils. "Fire," Frank said, his stroke-affected speech making the words sound slurred, but the urgency was unmistakable. "Kitchen." They moved together, Frank leaning heavily on Eleanor as they shuffled toward the source of the alarm. Through the archway, Eleanor could see orange flames dancing along the countertop, spreading rapidly from what appeared to be a dish towel near the stove. In her distraction, after opening the door for her children, she must have knocked it closer to the burner she'd been using to warm water for tea, a burner she'd forgotten to turn off in the chaos that followed. "Call 911, Frank ordered, already moving toward the kitchen despite his weakened condition. "I'll get the extinguisher." But Eleanor knew, even as she grabbed the phone with trembling hands, that the small fire extinguisher they kept under the sink wouldn't be enough. The flames had already spread to the curtains, those yellow gingham curtains she'd made herself 30 years ago, and were climbing toward the wooden cabinets Frank had installed when they'd renovated the kitchen in 1998. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice contrasted sharply with the panic flooding Eleanor's system. "Fire!" Eleanor gasped out, giving their address on Maple Street. "Kitchen fire, spreading fast. My husband, he had a stroke, he can't move quickly. Ma'am, I need you both to evacuate the house immediately," the dispatcher instructed. "Leave everything. Get out now. Fire trucks are already on the way." Eleanor dropped the phone and rushed back to the kitchen where Frank was spraying the extinguisher at the flames, but it was like fighting an ocean with a water pistol. The fire had found the grease trap above the stove, and suddenly the flames erupted upward with a whoosh that sent both Eleanor and Frank stumbling backward. "We have to go!" Eleanor shouted over the roar of the fire and the screaming alarm. "Frank, we have to leave now!" She grabbed her purse from the hall table, an automatic gesture born from decades of never leaving home without it, and Frank's jacket from the coat rack. The smoke was thickening rapidly, turning the air grey and toxic. Frank's breathing, already compromised from the stroke, became laboured and wheezing. They made it to the front door and out onto the porch just as flames began spreading to the living room, consuming the drapes, reaching for the furniture, for the photo albums on the shelves, for every physical reminder of the life they'd built together. Eleanor supported Frank down the porch steps, rain immediately soaking them both. The cold April downpour, a shocking contrast to the heat they'd just escaped. Neighbours were emerging from their homes, drawn by the smoke and sirens. Old Mr. Patterson from next door rushed over with an umbrella, his elderly wife trailing behind with blankets. The Johnsons from across the street, a young couple with twin toddlers, stood on their lawn, the husband on his phone, the wife clutching her children close. "Are you both okay?" Mr. Patterson asked, trying to shield them from the rain. "Eleanor, Frank, is anyone else inside?" "Just us," Frank managed, his breathing ragged. "Just us, always just us." The fire trucks arrived within 6 minutes, 3 of them, along with an ambulance. Firefighters swarmed the scene, dragging hoses, shouting instructions. But even as they worked, Eleanor could see through the windows that the fire had taken hold with devastating efficiency. The living room was engulfed. Smoke poured from the upstairs windows where the bedrooms were, where she and Frank had slept for 44 years, where they'd comforted children during nightmares, where they'd dreamed of a future that looked nothing like this present hell. Paramedics guided them into the ambulance, checking Frank's vitals with growing concern. His blood pressure was dangerously elevated, his oxygen levels dropping. The stress of the evening, combined with the smoke inhalation and the physical exertion of escaping, was pushing his compromised system to its limits. "We need to transport him to the hospital," one paramedic told Eleanor. "His condition is deteriorating. Are you injured at all, ma'am?" Eleanor shook her head, unable to speak, unable to process anything beyond the sight of her home burning, flames now visible through the roof, 44 years of life reduced to smoke and ash and memory. The rain couldn't stop it. The firefighters' efforts, heroic as they were, could only contain it, prevent it from spreading to neighboring homes. The Miller house was already lost. "Ma'am, is there someone we can call for you?" the other paramedic asked gently. "Family. Friends, family." The word stabbed through Eleanor like a blade. She thought of Michael's expensive wool coat disappearing into the night, Sarah's cold clinical assessment of their lives, David's artistic hands gesturing dismissively at their memories, Emily's refusal to meet her eyes. "We have children," Eleanor heard herself saying, her voice distant and strange. 4 children, Michael, Sarah, David, Emily. She recited their phone numbers from memory, numbers she'd called countless times, with invitations to dinner, with requests for help, with messages of love that had once been returned. The paramedic wrote them down, promised to call them once they reached the hospital. The ambulance ride passed in a blur of flashing lights and medical jargon, and Frank's labored breathing beside her. Eleanor held his hand, the calloused, trembling hand that had built a treehouse and changed diapers and worked 60-hour weeks and held her through every crisis of their married life. That hand gripped hers with desperate strength now, and she gripped back, the two of them clinging to each other, because there was literally nothing else left to hold on to. Providence General Hospital's emergency room was a fluorescent nightmare of antiseptic smells and beeping machines and brisk efficiency. Frank was rushed into immediate care, doctors surrounding him, and Eleanor was ushered to a private waiting area with promises that someone would update her soon. She sat in a plastic chair, still wearing her smoke-stained clothes, her hair damp from the rain, her purse clutched in her lap. Inside that purse was her wallet containing $83 in cash and a debit card connected to an account with approximately $4,200, their checking account balance before this disaster. No credit cards, those had been paid off and closed years ago. No savings account that had been depleted paying for Frank's initial stroke treatment. No home that was currently burning to the ground. No children. Those had walked away into the night and never looked back. "Mrs. Miller," a nurse appeared, young and kind-faced. "Your husband is stable for now, but he's had another minor stroke, likely triggered by the stress and smoke inhalation. The doctors are running tests. It'll be a few hours before we know more. I tried calling the numbers you gave us for your children, but I haven't been able to reach anyone yet. Of course not. Michael had probably seen the hospital number and ignored it. Sarah was likely already asleep, her phone on Do Not Disturb mode. David never answered unknown numbers. Emily was probably arguing with William about what their father had said, wondering if it was true, deciding it didn't matter either way. "Is there anyone else?" the nurse asked gently. "Anyone else we can call?" Eleanor shook her head. Their parents were long dead. Frank's brother had passed away from cancer 12 years ago. Eleanor's sister lived in a nursing home in Florida with advanced dementia. Their few remaining friends were all elderly themselves, struggling with their own health issues and limitations. "No," Eleanor whispered, "there's no one else." The nurse squeezed her shoulder and disappeared, leaving Eleanor alone in the waiting room. She sat there for what might have been minutes or hours, time losing all meaning in this sterile, fluorescent limbo. Other people came and went, worried family members rushing in, relieved family members leaving. The constant flow of human crisis and human connection that Eleanor had somehow fallen outside of. At some point, a hospital social worker appeared, a tired-looking woman in her 50s named Patricia, who sat down beside Eleanor with a tablet and a sympathetic expression that suggested she'd had this conversation too many times before. "Mrs. Miller, I've been updated on your situation," Patricia said gently. "The fire department contacted us. I understand your home was destroyed tonight." Eleanor nodded, unable to find words. "Do you have homeowner's insurance?" "Yes," Eleanor managed, "but the deductible is $10,000, and we just used most of our savings for Frank's stroke treatment. We have about $4,200 in our checking account." Patricia made notes on her tablet. "Are you aware of any emergency housing resources? Do you have family or friends who can take you in temporarily?" Eleanor's laugh came out as a sob. "No, no one." "I see," Patricia said, her expression growing more concerned. "Mrs. Miller, I have to be honest with you. Your husband is going to need extended care. This second stroke, combined with the smoke damage to his lungs, means we're looking at a minimum 2-week hospital stay, possibly longer. After that, he'll need either intensive in-home care or a rehabilitation facility. The costs are going to be substantial, likely exceeding $100,000 even with insurance. $100,000, the amount Michael had demanded as his inheritance, the amount times 4 that their children had tried to extract from the home that was now a smoking ruin. "What do I do?" Eleanor asked, and she was crying now, tears streaming down her face, her voice breaking. "What do I do? I have nowhere to go. I have no money. My children hate me. My husband is dying. What do I do?" Patricia handed her a box of tissues, her professional composure cracking slightly. "There are shelters, but given your husband's medical needs, those won't work. There are social services, but the waiting lists are months long. I can connect you with a caseworker who specializes in elder care situations, but Mrs. Miller, I need you to understand that the system is overwhelmed. Even with help, you're looking at a very difficult road ahead." Eleanor buried her face in her hands, the reality of their situation crashing down with a weight that threatened to crush her completely. Homeless, penniless, abandoned, at 73 years old, after a lifetime of hard work and sacrifice and love, she and Frank were going to die alone, probably on the streets, forgotten by the children they'd given everything for. "Mrs. Miller," a new voice, male, deep and cultured. Eleanor looked up to see a man in his early 60s standing in the waiting room entrance, tall and distinguished with silver hair and kind grey eyes. He wore an expensive but understated suit, carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority, but his expression held genuine concern. "Yes?" Eleanor said, confused. "Do I know you?" "No," the man said, stepping closer. "My name is Richard Sterling. I was in the emergency room with my assistant who had a minor accident, and I overheard your conversation with the social worker. Mrs. Miller, I know this is highly unusual, but would you allow me to speak with you for a moment? Privately?" Patricia looked uncertain. but something in Richard Sterling's manner, perhaps his obvious wealth or the sincerity in his eyes, made her hesitate rather than refuse outright. "Mrs. Miller, you don't have to speak with anyone if you don't want to." But Eleanor found herself nodding. What did she have to lose? Pride, dignity, those had burned up with her home. Privacy. Her tragedy was already public record, witnessed by neighbors and firefighters and hospital staff. "It's fine," Eleanor said quietly. "You can leave us, Patricia. Thank you for your help." The social worker gathered her things reluctantly, giving Richard Sterling a warning look before departing. The mysterious businessman sat down in the chair Patricia had vacated, maintaining a respectful distance, but leaning forward with focused attention. "Mrs. Miller," Richard began, "I apologize for the intrusion during what is clearly the worst night of your life. But I heard what you told the social worker. I heard that you're alone, that your children have abandoned you, that you're facing impossible circumstances, and I want to help." Eleanor stared at him, waiting for the catch, the angle, the hidden agenda. In her experience, strangers didn't offer help without expecting something in return. "Why?" she asked bluntly. "You don't know me. Why would you care?" Richard's expression shifted, pain flickering across his features. "Because 7 years ago, I was a wealthy, successful businessman, too busy with deals and acquisitions and building my empire to visit my mother in her assisted living facility. I sent money. I paid for the best care, but I didn't visit. I was always too busy, always had another meeting, another opportunity, another excuse. And when she died, alone in that facility, the nurses told me she'd asked for me every single day. Every single day for 3 years, she asked when her son was coming, and I never came." His voice cracked, and Eleanor saw tears in those grey eyes. "I would give everything I have, Mrs. Miller, every penny of the fortune I built while neglecting the woman who gave me life, to go back and spend just 1 more hour with my mother. I can't do that. But I can, perhaps in some small way, atone for my failure by helping someone else's mother who needs it. So please, let me help you. Let me pay for your husband's medical care. Let me make sure you both have somewhere safe to stay. Let me do what I should have done for my own mother." Eleanor searched his face for any sign of deception or manipulation and found only raw, honest grief and genuine desire to help. This stranger, this wealthy businessman who owed her nothing, was offering her a lifeline when her own children had left her to drown. "I don't understand," Eleanor whispered. "People don't just do this. They don't just help strangers." "Some people do," Richard said gently. "Not enough, perhaps, but some. And tonight, I'm one of them. Please, Mrs. Miller, let me help. Not because you owe me anything, not because I expect anything in return, but because someone needs to. And I happen to be here, with the means to do it, and the desperate need to be better than I was to my own mother." Eleanor Miller, 73 years old, exhausted and broken, and more alone than she'd ever been in her life, looked at this mysterious stranger offering salvation, and for the first time that terrible night felt a spark of something that wasn't despair. "Okay," she said simply. "Okay." Richard Sterling smiled, and in that smile Eleanor saw not just relief but purpose, as if this random encounter in a hospital waiting room had given him something he'd been searching for since his mother's death 7 years ago, a chance at redemption. Neither of them knew it yet, but that acceptance, that simple okay, would set in motion a chain of events that would eventually expose every dirty secret, every hidden crime, and every consequence that the Miller children had thought they could escape. The night of April 22nd, 2024, had destroyed Frank and Eleanor Miller's home and shattered their family. But from those ashes, with the help of an unlikely angel, something else was about to be born. Justice. The 3 months after the fire, on a warm July morning in 2024, Eleanor Miller sat in the sunroom of the guest house on Richard Sterling's estate in Lake Oswego, watching hummingbirds dart among the fuchsias. The view overlooked a pristine lake, the water sparkling in the early morning light, so different from the modest backyard of the Maple Street house that existed now only in memory and photographs salvaged from the cloud storage Eleanor had forgotten she'd set up years ago when Emily had insisted on it. Frank was in physical therapy in the main house, his third session of the week. The second stroke had set back his recovery significantly, but with Richard's financial support, he'd received the best care available. Dr. Morrison, a renowned neurologist, had taken over his case. Physical therapists came daily. Occupational therapists worked with him on regaining independence. Speech therapists helped him overcome the increased difficulty with words the second stroke had caused. Eleanor still couldn't quite believe any of it was real. The guest house alone was larger than the home they'd lost, furnished with quiet elegance and every comfort. Richard had insisted they stay as long as needed, had paid every medical bill without hesitation, had treated them not as charity cases, but as honored guests. More than that, he'd treated them with a dignity and respect that their own children had stripped away. Mrs. Miller, Richard's assistant, Jennifer, appeared in the doorway, a young woman in her late 20s with warm brown eyes and an efficiency that reminded Eleanor of Sarah before Sarah had become so cold. "Mr. Sterling asked if you'd join him in his office when you have a moment. He says it's important." Eleanor set down her teacup, a flutter of anxiety passing through her chest. Over the past 3 months, Richard had become more than a benefactor. He'd become a friend. Someone she and Frank could talk to, someone who listened without judgment, who shared meals with them, who seemed genuinely invested in their well-being. But his office was his professional domain, and whenever he called them there, it meant serious business. She made her way through the main house, past rooms filled with art and books, and the accumulated treasures of a life well lived and successfully built. Richard's office was on the second floor, a spacious room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. He stood behind his mahogany desk, but he wasn't alone. A woman in a sharp pantsuit sat in one of the leather chairs facing the desk, a briefcase open on her lap. A man in his 40s stood by the window, his posture suggesting law enforcement or military background. "Eleanor," Richard greeted her, coming around the desk to guide her to a chair. "Thank you for coming. I want to introduce you to some people. This is Patricia Chen. She's an attorney specializing in financial fraud. And this is Marcus Webb, a private investigator I've had on retainer for many years." Eleanor's heart began to race. "What's this about?" Richard sat on the edge of his desk, his expression serious but not unkind. "It's about your son-in-law, William Hartwell, and the fraud your husband mentioned the night of the fire. Eleanor, I've spent the last 3 months investigating, and what we've found is considerably worse than even Frank suspected." Patricia Chen opened a folder, pulling out documents that looked official and intimidating. "Mrs. Miller, 5 years ago, when your husband sold his hardware store, the buyer was a company called Cascade Property Holdings. The sale price was $215,000, correct?" "Yes," Eleanor confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. "The store had been independently appraised at $823,000, Patricia continued. "What your husband didn't know was that Cascade Property Holdings was a shell corporation created specifically for this transaction. The actual buyer was Summit Retail Group, who purchased the property from Cascade 3 months later for $1.2 million. Eleanor felt dizzy. $1.2 million? The property value had actually increased in the intervening months, Marcus Webb explained, his voice matter-of-fact. "Your husband's store was in a rapidly developing area. Summit Retail demolished the building and constructed a mixed-use development that's currently valued at over $8 million. But the key here is the difference between what your husband was paid and what the property was immediately resold for. That difference, minus some operating expenses, was divided between 3 parties: the principals of Cascade Property Holdings, a finder's fee recipient, and a consulting fee recipient." "William Hartwell," Eleanor said, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "William Hartwell," Patricia confirmed, "received a finder's fee of $78,000 and a consulting fee of $93,000. a total of $171,000 for facilitating the fraudulent sale of his father-in-law's business. But that's not all. Mr. Webb's investigation revealed a pattern. William has done this before, multiple times, targeting elderly business owners, usually through family connections or social relationships. Over the past 8 years, he's been involved in at least 6 similar schemes. The total amount defrauded from his victims exceeds $4.3 million. Eleanor couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt around her. Emily knows. That's harder to prove, Marcus said carefully. The money went into accounts solely in William's name. However, they purchased their home 18 months after your husband's sale, paying cash, $750,000. William's declared income for that year was only $123,000. His explanation for the sudden wealth would be very difficult to justify. Richard moved to pour Eleanor a glass of water from the pitcher on his desk, handing it to her with a steady hand. Eleanor, Patricia believes we have enough evidence to pursue both criminal and civil action against William. The statute of limitations hasn't expired. The fraud was concealed, which extends the time period for prosecution. We could potentially recover the money Frank lost, plus damages, plus penalties. We're looking at a potential settlement or judgment of over $2 million. $2 million! The number echoed in Eleanor's mind, meaningless and enormous simultaneously. But Emily, she whispered, this would destroy Emily's marriage. It would destroy her life. Emily's marriage is built on fraud and stolen money, Patricia said, her tone gentler than her words. Mrs. Miller, I understand she's your daughter. But she's been living in a house purchased with money stolen from you and your husband. She's been enjoying a lifestyle funded by your loss. At what point does protecting her become participating in the crime? Eleanor thought about Emily, her youngest, her baby. Emily at 5 years old, bringing her wildflowers from the yard. Emily at 13, crying about a boy who'd broken her heart. Emily at 22, walking across the stage to receive her architecture degree, turning to blow a kiss to her parents in the audience. Emily at 33, standing in the Miller living room demanding they sell their home, refusing to meet her mother's eyes. What do you need from me? Eleanor asked quietly. Your permission to proceed, Richard said, and Frank's. This is your decision, Eleanor. I'll support whatever choice you make. If you want to let it go, to leave it buried, I'll respect that. But if you want justice, if you want accountability, then Patricia and Marcus can make that happen. Eleanor looked at the documents spread across the desk, evidence of betrayal and greed, proof that the suffering she and Frank had endured was not just the result of bad luck or poor planning, but of deliberate, calculated theft by someone who should have been family. She thought about the night of the fire, about sitting in that hospital waiting room with nowhere to go and no one to turn to, about the absolute despair that had nearly destroyed her. Frank should be back from therapy soon, Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger. I need to discuss this with him, but Richard, I think I already know what he'll say. We've spent our entire lives teaching our children about consequences, about responsibility, about doing the right thing even when it's hard. Maybe it's time they learned those lessons, even if we're the ones who have to teach them. Richard nodded, respect evident in his expression. Take whatever time you need. This isn't about revenge, Eleanor. It's about justice. There's a difference. Eleanor spent the next 2 hours with Frank in their guest house, the documents spread across their dining table, Patricia Chen's summary laid out in devastating detail. Frank read slowly, his stroke-affected vision requiring breaks, but his anger grew with each revelation. When he finished, he looked at Eleanor with tears streaming down his weathered face. He stole from us, Frank said, his speech slow but clear. He stole from us, and then he convinced our daughter that we were the problem. He stole from us, and then he led our children to abandon us. Everything that happened, the fire, the hospital, the desperation, it all traces back to him, to William, and to the greed he cultivated in our children. So we proceed, Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. We proceed, Frank confirmed, not just for us, for the other people he's defrauded. for the next elderly person he might target. We proceed. The legal machinery began moving with surprising speed once Frank and Eleanor signed the necessary documents. Patricia Chen filed both criminal complaints with the district attorney's office and civil suits against William Hartwell, Cascade Property Holdings, and several associated entities. Marcus Webb provided evidence to law enforcement that had been investigating similar fraud cases. The web of William's crimes, once pulled into the light, proved extensive and damning. The story broke in the Portland Tribune on August 15, 2024. Local financial consultant charged in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme targeting elderly business owners. The article detailed 6 cases, including Frank's, complete with quotes from victims and their families. William Hartwell's photograph appeared alongside the story, his polished professional headshot now associated with words like fraud, exploitation, and elder abuse. By August 16th, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. By August 17th, Williams' consulting firm had issued a statement terminating his employment. By August 18th, 3 more victims had come forward, extending the scope of the investigation. And by August 19th, Emily called. Eleanor was in the garden when her phone rang, Emily's name appearing on the screen for the first time in 4 months. Her hand trembled as she answered. "Mom?" Emily's voice was thick with tears, ragged with emotion. "Mom, is it true? Please tell me it's not true." Eleanor closed her eyes, pain and pity and anger warring in her chest. "It's true, Emily, all of it. Your husband defrauded your father. He stole from us, and he used that money to build the life you've been living." "I didn't know," Emily sobbed. "Mom, I swear to you, I didn't know. I never looked at his business accounts. I never questioned where the money came from. I trusted him." "Oh God, Mom, what have I been living on? What have I been part of?" "I don't know if you knew or not," Eleanor said, and her voice was colder than she'd ever heard it. "But you knew we were struggling. You knew your father had a stroke. You knew we needed help. And you came to our home and demanded we make ourselves homeless to give you money. So even if you didn't know about William's crimes, Emily, you participated in our suffering. You chose greed over love. You chose money over your parents." The silence on the other end was broken only by Emily's crying, deep, wrenching sobs that might have moved Eleanor once, but now felt like too little, too late. "I want to make this right," Emily finally said. "Mom, please, I want to make this right. I'm leaving William. I'm filing for divorce. I'm cooperating with the investigators. I'll testify against him. I'll do whatever it takes. Please, Mom, please tell me there's a way to make this right." Eleanor thought about forgiveness, about the woman she'd been 4 months ago who would have accepted this apology immediately, who would have welcomed her daughter back with open arms simply because she was her daughter. But that woman had burned up in the fire on Maple Street. The woman who remained was harder, wiser, and less willing to accept words without actions. "What about your brothers and sister?" Eleanor asked. "Have they called? Have they apologized? Have any of them even acknowledged what happened?" Emily's silence was answer enough. "I thought not," Eleanor said. "Emily, I appreciate that you're leaving William. I appreciate that you're cooperating with the investigation. But an apology without changed behavior is just manipulation. You want to make this right? Then actually do it. Show us. Don't tell us. And maybe someday we can have a conversation about rebuilding something. But not today, not now. The wound is too fresh and the betrayal runs too deep." "Mom," Emily started, but Eleanor gently ended the call. She sat in Richard's garden, surrounded by beauty and security that she'd never expected to have again, and allowed herself to cry. Not for what was lost, that grief had been processed over the last 4 months, but for what could never be recovered. The innocence of believing her children loved her unconditionally, the faith that family bonds were unbreakable, the certainty that her sacrifices had been worth it. The civil case proceeded through the fall. William Hartwell, facing overwhelming evidence and pressure from prosecutors offering a plea deal in the criminal case, agreed to a settlement in October. $2.1 million paid from the liquidation of assets, including the house he and Emily had purchased with stolen money. The criminal case resulted in a plea agreement. William pled guilty to 6 counts of fraud, receiving a sentence of 8 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole after 5. Frank and Eleanor, with Richard's guidance, used $1 million to establish the Miller Foundation for Abandoned Parents, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping elderly individuals who had been financially exploited or abandoned by their families. The foundation provided emergency housing, legal assistance, medical support, and counseling services. Richard served as chairman of the board, contributing both his own wealth and his business acumen to ensure the foundation's success. The remaining $1.1 million was invested conservatively, generating enough income to ensure Frank and Eleanor would never face financial desperation again. Richard insisted they continue living in the guest house as long as they wished, but he also helped them purchase a modest condominium in Portland, giving them independence and security on their own terms. The story of the Miller family's betrayal and the subsequent exposure of William Hartwell's crimes received significant media attention throughout the fall and winter of 2024. Local news stations ran features on elder exploitation. The district attorney's office used the case as an example in a new initiative to protect elderly residents from financial abuse. The Miller Foundation became a model for similar organizations in other states, and the reputations of Michael, Sarah, David, and Emily Miller were irrevocably damaged. Michael lost a major contract when the client company discovered his connection to the scandal. "We cannot associate with individuals who abandon elderly parents in medical crisis," their public statement read. The professional consequences extended beyond that single contract. In industries where relationships and reputation mattered, the story of Michael Miller demanding his inheritance while his father recovered from a stroke became a cautionary tale. Sarah's pediatric practice faced parent complaints and concerns. How could someone who abandoned her own parents be trusted with children? The medical board received formal complaints questioning her ethical judgment. While no professional sanctions resulted, her patient roster declined significantly, and her partner eventually bought her out of the practice at a substantial loss. David's artistic career, built on themes of family and connection, became a subject of mockery and criticism. How can he paint portraits of maternal love when he left his own mother homeless? One influential art critic wrote. Gallery showings were cancelled, commissions disappeared. The art world, for all its supposed tolerance, had limits when it came to moral hypocrisy. Emily, divorcing William and cooperating with prosecutors, faced perhaps the harshest judgment. Architecture clients questioned whether someone who'd lived off stolen money could be trusted with their projects and budgets. Her firm, trying to distance itself from the scandal, relegated her to minor projects before eventually suggesting she might be happier elsewhere. The 4 Miller children, who had once stood in their parents' living room demanding their inheritance, found themselves facing consequences they'd never imagined. Their wealth, their status, their carefully constructed lives, all built on foundations that proved far less stable than the love they'd rejected. On a cold January morning in 2025, Frank suffered another stroke, his third, massive and devastating. The ambulance rushed him to Providence General, the same hospital where Eleanor had sat 4 months after the fire, terrified and alone. But this time, she wasn't alone. Richard was there within 20 minutes. Jennifer arrived with coffee and comfort. Patricia Chen came to handle any legal matters that might arise. The Miller Foundation staff, people who had come to know and love Frank through his work with the organization, filled the waiting room with flowers and prayers and genuine concern. And Emily came, just Emily, alone, her face drawn and aged beyond her 34 years. She stood at the edge of the waiting room, uncertainty and grief written clearly in her expression, waiting for permission to approach. Eleanor looked at her youngest daughter, at the woman who had once been her baby, who had demanded her inheritance and walked away into the storm, who had lived on stolen money and participated in their suffering. She saw genuine remorse in Emily's eyes now, the kind that came from months of consequences, from losing everything, from understanding too late what really mattered. "You can sit," Eleanor said quietly, gesturing to an empty chair. "But he may not wake up, Emily. The doctors say this stroke was severe. Even if he survives, he may never be the father you remember." "I know," Emily whispered, sitting but maintaining distance, respecting boundaries that her mother had established. "I just wanted to be here. I wanted him to know, if he can know anything, that I'm sorry, that I finally understand what I destroyed, that I would give anything, anything at all, to go back and make different choices." Sarah arrived an hour later, then David, then finally Michael, each of them subdued, humbled by months of consequences and the stark reality of their father's mortality. They sat in the waiting room, 4 successful professionals reduced to frightened children, facing the loss of the parent they'd rejected, the parent whose love they'd taken for granted until it was too late to preserve the relationship. Frank lingered for 3 days, his strong heart fighting against impossible odds. The doctors allowed family members in 2 at a time, and Eleanor spent most of those 72 hours at her husband's bedside, holding his hand, talking to him, reminding him of their 54 years together, of the good times before everything broke. The children each took turns, sitting with their father, speaking words they should have said months or years earlier. Eleanor didn't know what they said during those visits. She gave them privacy for their goodbyes, their attempts at redemption, their desperate hope for forgiveness from a man who might never wake to grant it. Frank died on January 19th, 2025, with Eleanor beside him, his hand in hers. 76 years of life ending quietly in a hospital room overlooking the city he'd called home for most of his life. His last conscious moment had been 2 days earlier, when he'd squeezed Eleanor's hand and whispered, "Our foundation. Keep it going. Help them. Them." The other abandoned parents, the other elderly victims, the other people who needed what Frank and Eleanor had found through Richard Sterling: rescue, justice, and dignity. The funeral was held at St. Mary's Church in Portland, a service attended by 237 people. Richard Sterling delivered a eulogy about a man he'd known for less than a year, but who had changed his life by accepting help and transforming it into a foundation that would help countless others. Foundation staff and volunteers spoke about Frank's dedication, his wisdom, his genuine care for the people they served. Former employees from the hardware store remembered a fair boss and generous friend. Michael, Sarah, David, and Emily sat in the front row with Eleanor, but they did not speak at the service. They had lost that right, and they knew it. They sat in silence, grief and regret written on their faces, understanding finally, devastatingly, that some consequences are irreversible, some bridges once burned cannot be rebuilt, and some forgiveness, even if eventually granted, can never restore what was destroyed. After the service, after the burial in a plot that Richard had insisted on purchasing in a cemetery with views of Mount Hood, after the reception where people shared memories and offered condolences, Eleanor returned to the guest house at Richard's estate. She was 74 years old, a widow, a mother estranged from her children despite their belated remorse, and the director of a foundation dedicated to helping other people avoid the fate that had nearly claimed her and Frank. Emily had asked, tentatively, if they could talk. Michael had mentioned carefully that they wanted to continue making amends. Sarah had suggested hopefully that perhaps time would heal what had been broken. David had offered quietly to donate his art to foundation fundraisers. Eleanor had told them all the same thing: actions, not words. Show me who you've become, not who you wish you'd been. And maybe someday, we can build something new. But it won't be what we had. That's gone forever. You made sure of that on April 22nd, 2024. She sat in the sunroom as the winter sun set over the lake, holding a photograph salvaged from her cloud storage. Frank and Eleanor on their 50th anniversary, surrounded by their 4 children and 7 grandchildren, everyone smiling, everyone together. A family that looked perfect on the surface but was already fracturing underneath from entitlement and greed and the slow poison of taking love for granted. The foundation would continue. Frank's legacy would live on in every elderly person helped, every victim supported, every family saved from the fate that had nearly destroyed them. The children would perhaps eventually redeem themselves through years of consistent action and genuine change. Emily had already begun, volunteering with the foundation, living modestly, dedicating herself to making amends not just to her mother, but to the world. But some things, Eleanor understood now, could never be recovered. The innocence of unconditional parental love, the certainty of family bonds, the belief that sacrifice and love were always rewarded, the feeling of home that had burned up with the house on Maple Street. In their place was something harder, wiser, more realistic. Eleanor Miller had learned the bitter truth that loving someone doesn't guarantee they'll love you back, that giving everything doesn't ensure gratitude, that family bonds can break under the weight of greed and selfishness. But she'd also learned that redemption is possible, that strangers can become angels, that from ashes can rise something meaningful and lasting. The sun set completely, darkness falling over the lake, and Eleanor Miller, survivor of abandonment and fire and heartbreak, turned on the lights and began reviewing applications for the Foundation's next round of assistance. Somewhere out there were other elderly parents facing crises, other victims of exploitation and neglect, other people who needed what she and Frank had found: rescue, justice, and the strength to rebuild. She couldn't save her own family, but she could, with the foundation Frank had insisted she continue, help save others. And in that work, in that purpose, she found something that resembled peace, if not quite happiness. The harvest had indeed been bitter, but from those bitter seeds, carefully tended, something worthy was growing. The Miller children's redemption, if it came, would be the work of years, earned through consistent action and genuine change. Eleanor would watch, would wait, would allow the possibility without demanding it. But the relationship they'd once had, the unconditional love and unlimited forgiveness that was buried alongside Frank on the hillside overlooking Mount Hood. Some consequences Eleanor had learned through fire and loss and betrayal are simply irreversible. And perhaps in the end, that was the most important lesson. Cherish love while you have it, honor those who sacrifice for you, and understand that there are some mistakes so fundamental that they change everything, forever, irreparably. The Miller children would spend the rest of their lives learning that lesson. Eleanor, in her grief and wisdom and hard-won peace, had already learned it, and in the learning had found a way to transform her pain into purpose, her loss into legacy, and her bitter harvest into something that might, eventually, nourish others facing similar darkness. The story of the Miller family serves as a reminder that the bonds we take for granted can shatter under the weight of greed, that love demanded rather than given freely becomes exploitation, and that some actions carry consequences that echo across generations. But it also reminds us that redemption is possible, that strangers can become family, and that from our deepest losses can come our most meaningful legacies.